Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute epic that is the evolution of the European Union. We're talking about a literal rising from the ashes journey, from a shattered post-war continent all the way to a modern global superpower. We're going to explore exactly how this incredible and, frankly, totally unprecedented transformation actually happened over the last few decades.
And this brings us to a massive historical question. Think about it. How on earth do you take a continent that was completely leveled by war in 1945 and get formerly bitter enemies to sit down at conference tables together? How do you forge a lasting, supranational union out of that kind of devastation? Well, it's an absolutely fascinating story of diplomacy, economics, and some seriously visionary leadership. So let's break it all down.
Okay, picture this. The year is 1945. European cities are just now starting to recover from staggering wartime destruction. You've got families and workers forced to literally rebuild their lives and their countries from the rubble. And during this incredibly dark time, leaders realized something crucial. Deep, structural integration was really the only true antidote to the extreme nationalism that had just devastated their continent. They desperately needed a concrete, economic guarantee that a massive conflict like that could never, ever happen again.
So let's jump right into Chapter 1. From Ruins to Recovery, the Post-War Vision. While the rubble was quite literally still being cleared, you had visionary leaders already imagining a highly cooperative future. Take Winston Churchill, for example. In a really famous speech at the University of Zurich in 1946, he boldly stated, "We must build a kind of United States of Europe." And look, that wasn't just lofty rhetoric. That sentiment perfectly mirrored a massive push by various diplomats and federalists to actively bind these nations together in a truly meaningful way. And this economic cooperation? It evolved surprisingly fast. In 1948, the Marshall Plan injects massive funds from the US to fuel recovery across Western Europe. Then, by May 9, 1950, you have the Schuman Declaration drafted by 6 nations: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, West Germany, and Italy. This historic piece of paper directly led to the 1952 establishment of the European Coal and Steel Community. Basically, by pooling their heavy industries together, these nations made war between historic rivals, like France and Germany, not just unthinkable, but materially impossible. Moving right along to Chapter 2, Birth of the Union, Amalgamating the Treaties. Now, the journey to the modern EU wasn't just one giant leap. Actually, it was more like a snowball effect of overlapping and evolving treaties. Step 1 saw the creation of the European Economic Community and Euratom. This expanded cooperation way beyond just heavy industry into broader economics and atomic energy. Fast forward a bit to a huge milestone, the 1993 Maastricht Treaty. This officially established the European Union as we know it today and introduced this incredibly important concept of EU citizenship. Finally, we get the 2009 Treaty of Lisbon, which streamlined operations and officially incorporated the EU as a juridical person on the international stage.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, the Engine of Europe, how the Union is governed.
So, the EU is defined as a supranational union. Practically speaking, this means it operates on a really complex hybrid system of both intergovernmental and supranational decision-making. It runs on 2 big ideas. First, the principle of conferral, meaning the EU only acts within the strict limits agreed upon by member states in their treaties. And second, subsidiarity, which means it only steps in when objectives simply cannot be achieved by member states acting on their own. It is an incredibly unique political balancing act.
To actually manage all of this, the EU relies on some principal governing bodies working in a highly dynamic diplomatic environment. You've got the European Commission acting as the executive branch. They propose the legislation and handle the day-to-day. Then the European Parliament and the Council of the EU share the legislative duties, meaning they're the ones scrutinizing, debating, and amending those laws. And finally, the Court of Justice is there to ensure EU law is interpreted and applied correctly across the whole continent.
Let's pivot to Chapter 4, the Economic Powerhouse, Trade, Currency, and Influence. 27. That is the number of member states in the Union today. From those original Inner 6 founders we talked about, the Union has grown massively through these highly symbolic accessions over the decades, spanning incredibly diverse European landscapes and cultures.
The absolute cornerstone of all this economic weight is the single market. This is what enables the free circulation of goods, capital, people, and services. Just think about the massive logistics of this for a second. High-speed trains crossing national borders without even stopping, cargo aircraft moving freely, consumers shopping for goods sourced from across the continent without a single tariff.
It required standardizing massive amounts of legislation just so commerce could flow seamlessly from one country to the next.
And within that single market, we have a staggering number, 345 million. That's how many citizens currently live in the Eurozone. These 20 member states have entirely superseded their national currencies with a single shared currency. Imagine the sheer convenience and the volume of daily economic activity that unlocks. You can pull the exact same notes out of an ATM in Paris, Berlin, or Rome, allowing both tourists and huge multinational businesses to operate without any exchange rate friction whatsoever.
This kind of deep integration translates into massive global influence, for sure. The euro is now the second largest reserve currency and the second most traded currency in the entire world, sitting just right behind the US dollar.
Okay, Chapter 5, Life Across Borders, Daily Impact on Citizens.
So, this is where the policy meets the pavement. The EU fundamentally shapes daily life for its people. It gives citizens the freedom to live, work, or study in any member state they choose. It creates standardized environmental frameworks, which drives continent-wide investments into things like wind farms, solar parks, and clean energy. And crucially, it allows for massive joint responses to crises. Whether that's enacting massive joint recovery funds after the COVID-19 pandemic or coordinating humanitarian aid globally, the impact on the ground is huge.
Finally, let's look ahead. Chapter 6, The Future of Europe, Challenges and Expansion. Now, it hasn't all been smooth sailing, right? The EU faces ongoing, highly complex geopolitical shifts. In 2020, we saw the unprecedented withdrawal of the United Kingdom, obviously known as Brexit. Then, in 2022, the EU demonstrated a whole new level of rapid geopolitical coordination by approving joint arms supplies and aid for Ukraine. Looking forward, they've set an ambitious target to be institutionally ready for even further enlargement by 2030, with several new countries actively aspiring to join. These represent massive administrative and diplomatic hurdles, requiring complex international summits and some seriously coordinated policymaking. Which leaves us with a pretty profound final thought. As Europe looks to tomorrow, investing in smart cities, clean energy, and cutting-edge space technology, how will this unprecedented union continue to evolve and influence our interconnected world? I mean, from the ashes of 1945 to the frontier of tomorrow, the European experiment continues to be one of the most fascinating political journeys in human history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.